Hello and welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design and talk about the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. Welcome, Phil. Glad to have you with me today.
Well, Happy New Year to you. Is it a bit late to say that? Well, I mean, let's say it anyway. Happy New Year, Tony.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to everyone watching the recording. Thanks for watching. It's happiness everywhere. More happiness in January.
Happiness is everywhere. That's what an opener.
On that note,
anyway, goodbye.
Bye, see you later. Okay, so today we're talking about casting in learning design and in teaching. Casting is an interesting one because it's often something that you're not really allowed to go near. It's often the case that you can't talk about personality in teaching, and we thought that when we come across those sort of non-negotiables, we often tend to challenge them because we think, well, why is that? And I think casting is a really interesting one. And just before Christmas, we did a restream on the Kudashev effect and linked and editing and the parallels with film and learning. And I think there's a really strong parallel again here with film and learning design in the role of casting. So this idea of casting and what it means in an education experience, we thought was quite a useful metaphor. So the idea of the casting director, why you put certain people in certain roles. So probably useful to start with a little bit of an explanation as to how casting works in films. Now, Phil, you're much more of a film buff than me. So how does casting work in films?
Well, first of all, I feel more than slightly responsible for the fact that when we're talking about learning design or trying to bring this subject to life, really, we often find ourselves, well, I do anyway, reaching for another discipline entirely. And I just want to put that out there and say it's because I think that learning design, like everything, brings with it some baggage around its parameters. And I never feel that learning design, for me, as a remit, it's the remit of everything. It's highly expansive because if you come from a design background, design is this extraordinary mindset where you are problem solving within a context and you're drawing upon all sorts of different things to make something better. And that seems like a very expansive, creative, and it's about dealing with complexity. I think sometimes when I hear other people tell me what they think learning design is, it very quickly devolves to, do you create slide decks or do you create quizzes? And although a slide deck and a quiz may be absolutely the answer in that kind of ecosystem of resources to produce something amazing, learning design does not mean those things. I think if you look at a job description, it might mean, can you do those things? But the two words alone, learning, massively expansive, and design, massively expansive, if you put those two words together, it should produce this massively expansive conversation. My concern is that you put those two words together and the conversation gets much, much smaller and much, much narrower. And I find that personally and intellectually and from a linguistics perspective terribly frustrating, which is why we're having a conversation today about casting directors and not learning designers. And I don't want people to get confused because we are talking about learning and we are always talking about producing the conditions most likely to bring about tangible transformations in the lives and imaginations of other people. That is all we are ever talking about. And I sometimes feel that, and you may not agree with me, Tony, but I sometimes feel that learning design doesn't necessarily equate to that wonderful and rich and human ambition somehow.
No, it's true. And I think there's an interesting parallel there. We often talk about hidden learning designers, people in roles that don't have learning design in the title, but are effectively responsible for structuring learning experiences. And I do think that there's a really strong parallel here with hidden casting directors. So if you are a director of learning, if you're a director of L&D, if you're an associate dean or a dean, and you have a team of people who are in front of people who are learning something, part of your role is a casting director. You might not think it is, but if you're choosing who goes in front of those learners, then that is what a casting director does. This idea, isn't it?
Yeah, so to answer your original question before, I think I was on a soapbox for a second there, but I've just stepped off. So So yes, casting directors. Well, the thing about casting directors is this: I'm always minded to talk about my stepfather in moments like this, because my stepfather, when he watches films, he absolutely believes that the moment that a character talks, that dialogue is being spontaneously produced. He's not interested in the backstage element of film design at all. He is just interested in the story and what's going on. So for him, it's all about that. That's real. So if I were to say to him, if he were here and I was talking about casting directors, he would A, not be interested in the conversation, and B, he would probably think, I can't believe there's a job role called casting directors. But casting directors on big movies are paid a huge amount of money. And the reason why they're paid a huge amount of money is because if you imagine all of the infrastructure that sits under a film, say you have the script, you have the production design, you have the carpenters, the caterers, the sparkies, the sound design, you have this incredible dream factory, right? And yet, if you get your casting wrong, nobody gives a damn. Nobody cares about the complexities that made that film happen. People are just going to go, well, that film was a dud. So we know that sort of like story and character are key to driving an experience. And so all of those complexities then become relevant and important and aligned to produce an intentional effect in the imaginations and minds and emotional experiences of other people. So I really do think that film and film production is a useful way to think about what we are talking about when we talk about what we think is important about designing learning experiences. It really is about bringing all of those elements together. So the casting director, I think, is like an invisible powerhouse. It's like, because all of that budget, all of that effort is for naught if the casting isn't right, if the chemistry isn't right, if the link between the role of a character in the story and the persona that delivers that role, if they are misaligned, then you are essentially urinating in the breeze, in a way. You are, because those efforts can't go beyond that initial misalignment, I would say. And Tony began this, you began this by saying it is often taboo or difficult to talk about personality and people when it comes to kind of the casting of an educational experience, because you can have extraordinarily gifted people who also struggle to engage their learners. You can have very engaging people who are deeply disorganized and struggle to engage their learners because they don't know how to switch a projector on, or so sometimes, and what we need to caveat this conversation around is that traditionally learning design is seen as something that, I suppose, it's analogous to the script. Learning design isn't in the room when things are delivered. Learning design, that role stops. You hand this thing over, and then who's doing what, who's in front of the audience when, all of those things aren't in the purview of the learning designer, unless the learning designer is also, as you say, a hidden learning designer, in so much as they're a head of school, or that they're heading up an L&D department, and they are actively producing that effect. So why are we talking about it at all? And my answer to that when we spoke about this theme was that if we don't talk about it, we're not admitting to something important about the limits of learning design. We're not talking about the boundary of where our discipline perhaps meets the realities of teaching. So I think it is important that we talk about personalities, and that we get over the idea that it doesn't matter who's doing what, because I think it really, really does.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this idea that a casting director doesn't just pick a good actor. There's lots of good actors. They pick the right actors for that role in that particular film. And if you, again, parallel that with learning experiences, when we've been called in to fix multiple problems with clients where they think it's one thing, and you go in and you realize that the wrong person is delivering level 4, or the wrong person's delivering level 6. And it's such a common problem, because, so for example, you might have someone who's a fantastically knowledgeable, published loads of books, love their subject, world-class researcher. Often that person, and this is always a risk of generalizing here, but often that person isn't the best person for level 4, because they're focused at the kind of the end of level 6, the master's level, the people who can really do it well. They're not as interested in the people who can't do it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they're not a great educator.
Yeah.
It just means they're not the right people to motivate those learners coming out of school who can't do it, who will find basic things frustrating. This person may have 20, 30 years of experience, and they're just going to get frustrated by those learners because they can't do it yet.
Yeah, I think you end up there, and you end up very quickly with other stories getting started, so other narratives get started. The ones I tend to hear, if your casting isn't quite right, is isn't the quality of undergraduates getting worse? It's like, oh, my job would be easier if it wasn't for all of these stupid people. You hear that one, and then you hear, because obviously now, there's a bigger debate here, but in terms of where the power lives, in terms of like when you pay for education, it's like you pay for learning experience, is that you could have a group of people unable to value the extraordinary proximity to an expert. They're at a university. You've got a highly published, highly an extraordinary sort of erudite person here, who they think is useless. And so, in terms of student satisfaction, you have a narrative gets set up where this person is useless. This extraordinary researcher is useless. And then what happens is that researcher, I'm assuming the narrative of if you're into research, researching and teaching becomes siloed, and the whole thing becomes like this, quite for me, typical stroke boring narrative around universities. And so you have one story in which the people who are now kind of paying for the experience are blamed for not being more interested in this person's content. And then you have a situation where you have this big group of paying customers who literally cannot value or even disdain very intelligent people. And it's this weird thing about universities becoming irrelevant because they're full of really intelligent people who can't connect. Or you have universities are irrelevant because undergraduates are now so stupid and they're so sort of like, like open-mouthed that this thing isn't working. And I will say, to bring it back to casting, that you can do more in that quite simple way to literally undo some of those very tiresome and I think corrosive narratives about quality education and what it's all for, and the binary between research and teaching. All of that stuff is all caught up, I think, in who we put in front of who when.
Yeah, and I love this idea of in casting they have this idea of the chemistry test.
Yeah,
which was new. This was new to me, so I enjoyed reading about this. This idea that before you cast people in a film, like a leading man, leading woman in a role, you put them together, you give them some scenes, and you see if there's a connection, which I love. I think that's interesting. And then you translate that into education, and you could have, well, what would be an educational chemistry test then, if you put people together? So you could get some tutors together to deliver a sample session. That would be good. You could see if there was a natural chemistry there, or if they just didn't vibe off of each other. Maybe how they handled kind of like transitions between different parts of the session. If they have relevant examples, if they can kind of pull together if they have some sort of shared experience, if the pacing is the same, are they both kind of able to work with each other's pacing, or is one kind of too slow, one too fast? And then are they able to respond to questions effectively, or does one dominate the room, or are they able to kind of hand things over? Do they work as a team? Because team teaching done really well is like watching a great film. It's so amazing, and the students love it, the tutors love it, everyone has a great time. But again, like a poorly casted film, if it's wrong, then that whole thing's just going to flop, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think about sort of simple things, like what if you look at I think the success sometimes in terms of facilitation of sort of learning experiences, where you have the Q&A and the panel, and convening a panel, which is like a live chemistry test in that sense, because you've sort of no one person is carrying that whole session. You have someone who is a confident facilitator, and you can move, and that facilitator, like a casting director, is going, they're watching the room a little bit, and they're thinking, okay, that person's spoken just enough, and then move that around, and you bring in the different voice. And I think in that way, I don't think it's a stretch at all to prioritize the differences between people, because I think one of the taboos is that you're not allowed to talk about that,
Mm.
because you very quickly get into, I don't know, I mean, there might be people listening to this who can sort of sense a performance management vibe going on here. It's a bit like, well, you're not very good at sort of, you've had some poor student satisfaction, or when people look at the metrics of when people dip out of this short course, it's because of this person, but because you can't say it's because of this person, because that's a performance management thing and it will produce this big power, it doesn't get dealt with. When actually, I think the answer might be that, from a learning design perspective, I look at that and I think, well, what is this person? This person is obviously having an effect on the room. Are we not allowed to talk about that effect? Are we not allowed to sort of like be intentional about that effect? I mean, a great example for me is that, from my own experience, I recognized very early on that my strengths on my course were not connected to the delivery of very complicated, difficult 3D animation software, because I knew nothing about it. And I could have worried about that. I could have decided it made me an imperfect fit. But I understood very early on that one of my sort of, the way I could perform my expertise most successfully was in that sort of onboarding, community building role. And there were other colleagues of mine who I knew were much more interested in the minutiae of the discipline area, the subject specificity. Now, you might say that the obvious thing to do when you are trying to sort of like engage students in a learning experience is to put that expertise on day one, because that's what they've paid for. And I think that was happening for a time. But it turns out that a lot of learners were bringing their own concerns and worries and their own sort of dimensionality to that experience. And actually, they weren't ready to sort of meet the expert. They wanted to be reassured that expertise lived on the course. But to put that expert voice, that seniority, to put that sort of Jedi Knight in front of those young people on day one, looks like the right casting, but was a disaster, because actually the job that we were in were bringing people, producing a base level of confidence and literacy before they could even receive or accept or not feel terrified by that level of expertise. And I'm telling you now that that casting decision was instrumental in moving a course from 100% dissatisfaction through to 100% satisfaction. I don't like those metrics much. They're a blunt instrument, but they're the only evidence I have to bring to this conversation. The power of casting, the power of really looking at who was doing what and when, and which expertise which performance was front and center first. It was, I never forgot that lesson. And again, the content and the curriculum. Yeah, we all had that in place. That's the least that learners can expect. If you're going to come and do a course in animation or whatever it is, you expect the curriculum and expertise to be in place.
Yeah.
That's like a done deal. That's basically like that's your your essential level.
Yeah.
It was everything else that we were doing that ensured that we could get this show on the road, and that people wanted to stay and watch this film, if you like, to the end, because they were engaging with the people in front of them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if it's an interesting question to think, like, if you were to cast your dream education experience, what would you look for in your lead actors? And I think the interesting question there is, well, it depends, because you could say lots of energy, great listeners, able to ask insightful questions, able to bring the teaching to life with relevant inspirational examples. And there's probably some truth there in that you want that in at every level, but there's also different characteristics for different levels. So what would you want for people who couldn't do it? You'd want someone who was sympathetic, who was patient, who was able to facilitate, who was able to read the room. As those learners got more confident, you'd want someone who was able to bring in more direct expertise and give more stretching examples and things like that. So it's really important to think about the narrative going through a course as you would through a game or through a film. It's which people do you need to encounter when, in order to get that momentum and that trajectory that builds through to that exit velocity. And if you just if that's not right, as you say, that narrative is just going to collapse. Like, no one's going to be able to see why these people are there, because they're the wrong people in the wrong order.
Well, I remember, when I was very, very, very first teaching, so like back when I was 25, when I had hair, but not on my chin.
I remember those days.
Remember those days? Actually, you don't. I was, this was back. This is really back in the day stuff. I was lucky enough, really. Again, it's part of my formative experience. I worked on a particular photography course that was headed up by quite a formidable character, and they had a very interesting structure because the year one tutor was brilliant and perfect, but there was this sort of narrative on the course that there was somebody waiting for you in year two, a professor who was characterized by the fact he was out there published in making pictures. He was kind of like an enfant terrible of sort of, so he was waiting in the wings in year two. And I noticed very early on that waiting in the wings, that kind of like the person you were yet to meet, that was an absolute intentional piece of course design going on there. And even the first year tutor was like, well, this is great, I'm supporting you, but you know that in year two you are going to meet. And so there was a role had been cast that was around the middle stage of someone's learning journey. And I think we need to be careful here because we're drawing a lot on sort of an HE model, but you and I now have done a ton of different things for these short courses, apprenticeships, but that idea that there's a middle zone that you onboard and you get people to feel that they can do, a bit like good games design. You give people the first couple of levels that kind of help people feel successful and competent, and you give them their literacies. And then there's this sort of moment when it steps up a bit. And the thing I learned from this very sort of early teaching experience was the power of producing characterizations of staff that were intentional and produce an effect in the imagination of learners. The important thing about that is the effect was intentional, right? So it wasn't just like, oh my goodness, who wants to work in year two, or like who likes working with people who don't know their ass from their elbow yet.
Yeah, who likes this module?
Exactly. It was like, we have a character to cast for, and this really, I think, Tony, gets this really important piece around privileging and thinking about, in order to get the casting right, you have to know the function of the story or the function of that phase of the story. And we've talked about this a lot about level 4 and like the onboarding stage. And I hate onboarding again. It's just a term that we use. It means something, but it's like that special job of meeting people who don't know how to do the thing that you want them to do. That is a particular character at a particular moment. The casting of that is, I think, absolutely essential to be privileged, to be taken incredibly seriously. And I often see it not being taken seriously because it's like, it's the bit that people are it's the bit of the film or the bit of the casting that's a bit like, no top whack sort of blockbuster A-lister's going to do that role, because that's the sort of slightly pedestrian piece. And I would say no. I think the casting there, if you are a casting director and you're in that role, if you're sort of looking about who's going to sort of function and perform expertise, that first stage, I'm telling you that you can either get it supremely right, or you can produce problems forever after if you don't privilege that bit of casting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? It's that first part where you ideally meet learners where they are. That's the whole point. They can't do it. You meet them where they are. There's a period of onboarding. There's a period of stretching in the middle, and there's a period of consolidating at the end. And that's basically the 3-act structure. Same as a film, same in a novel. It's like, come in, figure out something out in the middle, and then you become someone different at the end because you know something. So yeah, I think this is key. It's, in many ways, that is the most important part, because if that bit doesn't happen, if there's a disconnect between those learners coming in and the people they're meeting, they may leave, they may not make it to the middle section. All sorts of problems occur there. So that bit, the on ramp, if you like, has to be right. Whatever context you're working in, HE, corporate, L&D, whatever it is, if you don't make that initial connection with learners and you don't help them feel valued, like they can do it, like this is the right thing, listened to, that you accept that they're in some kind of liminal space, probably they can't do it yet, and you have to be okay with that. That's so important. You can bring in an inspirational guest speaker or someone halfway through that experience to sort of turbocharge it or give it some momentum halfway through. But if you don't get that first bit right, you've lost them. You've lost everyone, and it's a waste of everyone's time.
Yeah, I think that notion of the guest speaker you brought up there just got me thinking again. Extend the narrative about cameos, because I mean, I still remember, again, I can only draw on my own terrible failures as a sort of an early bird sort of teacher, and I remember hearing the advice, knowing that year one needed some visiting lecturers because you were seeking to kind of like sprinkle some stardust.
Yeah.
And I remember, and this whole thing about come on industry, people want to be exposed to the industry. You've got to be doing that work, employability, yada, 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 all the good stuff. And so as a sort of an early birder, I was like, well, okay. So I remember I just went out and sort of collected a lot of people who were working in the industry. And I remember I brought this one person in, whose name I can't even remember, but he was, a young buck doing something extraordinary and exciting, and brought him in. And into year one, I brought him in quite early because I just thought, just to do a couple of sessions. And I'm telling you now, without any exaggeration, that myself and the course team were mopping up the damage that individual did in that room, because that person decided that they were so surprised by the reality of undergraduate, of first years. They were so surprised by the fact that people were at different levels and sort of that they were angry at learners, and that they were disdainful, and they scared people, and it went horribly wrong. And I suppose there's an argument that for some people that would have been this galvanic, extraordinary sort of like experience, but it was a complete disaster. We got that casting wrong because we just thought that we thought our brief was to bring industry in. And of course, that was the brief, to get a cameo, someone to come in, all guns blazing, because that was what the advice looked like. The advice looked like these first years need a bonfire lit under them by this person. And it was entirely the wrong thing to do. And we suffered for weeks afterwards because of this best practice moment. And after that, we sort of had to figure out exactly, we had to have a much more nuanced, we had to audition, much more closely our visiting lecturers. Do you like beginners?
Yeah.
Can you remember what it was like to not know how to do the things that you are now being paid an awful lot of money to do? Are you able to lead with vulnerability in this room around people who have got like a private hidden anxiety? They all have. And the answer, and if they literally just thought, well, that's not who I am, that's not what I'm for, then they're a guest lecturer that you bring in to the whole group further down the line to produce an effect where perhaps we're ramping up to sort of final submission, and you need someone to come in and go, hey, this is where you start paying and fame starts now. You bring that kind of persona in. You do not bring that persona in sort of early doors. You don't do that. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I really quickly figured out the game that we were actually in. I quickly figured out that in order to produce transformation in people, we had to be thinking about casting all the time. And I think people don't. I think people go, they look at, I'm going to ask you this question, Tony, because we're talking about, if you like, the ability just to sort of wish for the right people. But I know, because I've sat through so many validations and reframes and sort of like courses and emergency measures, when really the only thing people should be talking about is their casting. And people do not do it. They'll fiddle with a learning outcome. They might even bring learning designers in to say, hey, but it's like, you know what? This is a casting issue.
Casting issue. Yeah.
You've got the wrong people, but you've got the right people in the wrong place. Let's just say that, not the wrong people. I think there is such thing as the wrong people, but mostly it's the right person at the wrong point in the story, producing an unintended consequence
Yeah.
in your learners.
Yeah.
So for you, if you've got limited choice, if you've got like a limited, if you've got to work with a repertory theatre, you've got a bunch of actors that you always work with. How might learning design, or how might sort of what practical things could somebody do to play to people's strengths? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and obviously, in thinking about this in preparation for the session, I put some ideas together, because I think there are quite a lot of things you can do as whether you're a learning designer, whether you're an associate dean, whether you're a director of L&D. Like I say, you often have a limited pool of people you can work with. So what can you also do alongside casting? So we put together some thoughts around this. So I think the first one is, we call it the ensemble approach. So there's things that you can do around the people. So obviously you can break the content into smaller sections, so you can break up the delivery, but then really look at who you've got and figure out what their strengths are. Like we've been saying, like, what are they good at? Are they very expertise driven? Are they very learner focused? What are their strengths, and where are those strengths best deployed in that experience? And I think when you do have limited options, and you know that you might have some problematic casting decisions, perhaps, then include multiple voices and bring in different people into that experience for probably short periods of time to break it up. Because if you perhaps wouldn't want to give the whole thing to one facilitator or one lecturer or one actor or one developer. So how do you bring in those multiple voices? How do you sequence them, in what order, throughout that course of that experience? I think that's one thing you can do, this idea of a sort of an ensemble approach, I think.
I'm just seeing that there's a question in the chat from Kath Abaker, who absolutely is, knows her onions, and would have been in all of these situations. She's just sort of like signing her agreement in the idea of casting, and I don't know. I sometimes worry that when you have the analogy around film, that you're suggesting that everything's fictive, everything's a story, that what you're advocating for is performance in the worst sense, or a failure of authenticity. And all I would say, in terms of the authenticity piece, the reason why casting directors get paid the money they do is to produce authenticity. In other words, and we've talked about a bit before, Tony, about suspension of disbelief. Again, it's a term borrowed from a fictional realm, and I know that's my doing, but suspension of disbelief is the moment when the knowledge is just going in, that the resistance to knowledge you're not resisting. So casting when something is authentic, even if it's, we know that a degree course or a learning course or whatever it is a structure, and it is a structure that people are choosing to go through for their own reasons, so on and so forth. But I know authenticity is a hollowed out term, and it gets the arse kicked out of it. But for me, they all, like, what are we actually trying to achieve? And I think that notion of casting to produce a suspension of disbelief, because you've created an authentic learning space, which means that people are just listening to you. They're not fighting you. They're not resisting you. That they're not afraid anymore. That is why casting is so important. And if you are going to put the fear of God into people, and then to me that's an antagonist. That's an intentional piece of casting. I have done that myself. My colleague and I, when we used to teach, we used to sometimes understand that there was a nice cop, nasty cop moment coming on, or there would be a moment where the roles would move around. We were always interested in producing intentional effects and performing our personalities for a learning design driven point of view. We were very clear about that, and I've since become even more clear that if you're not talking about casting, if you're not talking about that level of intentionality, you are vulnerable to not understanding what the hell is going on in your beautifully designed course. that's the danger, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we've spoken about sort of bringing in those inspirational sort of guest lecturers, but I think there's also more you can do with, we call the supporting cast. So there's usually, if you're working in a large-ish organisation, there's usually a bunch of other people, often with quite advanced qualifications in learning, who might not necessarily always be in front of students, but might have a brilliant personality and might be absolutely the right person to bring in. And I've worked with loads of those people: learning support specialists, learning mentors, learning technologists, student support staff, librarians, and often they are absolutely the right person to get in front of those students at a particular moment, and often at the early stage of an experience. So I think when you're designing that experience, or casting it, or putting people in, figuring out what the sessions are, really think about who else you could bring in at the right moment for that session, or how that follows that. Who's the best person to bring in? What kind of expertise do we need? What kind of personality do we need in the room to support that particular aspect of the experience? And I think also you can think about how that person might shift more towards facilitation. So rather than coming into just broadcast their specialism, which may be brilliant, but actually it may be that that's completely the wrong thing. So how can you shift that person more towards facilitated activities? So we know that there's an assignment coming up, or there's a project that needs to happen, and actually there's a bunch of anxiety in the room. So coming in and sort of blowing more content at people is absolutely the wrong thing to do. So how do you think about facilitating activities over broadcasting content? So that's also really important, I think.
Yeah, I just want to, again, just to, to bring it out of the sky and pull it into sort of like my own experiences. I worked for I don't know, 4 or 5 years with a guest lecturer who would come in from an entirely different institution, and he was brought in to, if you like, collaborate with my students, and he was purposefully positioned as a non-creative who was coming to my students because he needed their creativity to light up a subject area that he was interested in, that he wanted to impact on different audiences. So he was a bioscientist, and my students were not bioscientists. In fact, the idea of science probably scared them half to death. So this academic would come in, and he's on LinkedIn. I sort of still follow him a bit. I won't name names so I don't embarrass him. But he would come in, and I used to just sit back. And it's always a risk bringing in externals. It's always a risk because you change the chemistry of what's going on. I brought this, and he was gifted. He was gifted with student engagement. He was gifted. Now, if he had been lecturing perhaps to I don't know, third years, it would have the tone would have been off. But he was perfect, and he and I went off and did a few conferences together about sort of like interdisciplinarity and so on and so forth. But he was gifted at performing his expertise to ensure that other people felt it was their expertise. He was gifted at giving it away, and he was gifted at producing warmth and willingness to go with him into areas that were unfamiliar. And I was always looking for more of him. Yeah. I was looking for more of him, because I just thought that's what we mean when we say get the right person in front of the students at the right time for the effect that you want to produce. That intentionality. And I know it's a taboo, because if you've got someone who is a turn off for students, and that I've met those people. It's sometimes what you have is that that they worry that they're a turn off for students because students are boring and don't understand enough. The students are too thick to find me interesting. I've heard that a lot. Yeah. But I don't want to get into this idea that this is about performance management. It's simply about, like, it's like the Avengers. It's a bit like Iron Man does his thing, Thor has a hammer, and everyone knows in those movies that there's a moment when everyone gets to do their thing. Yeah. That everyone gets to do their thing. And I just wish there was a bit more, we could relax a bit more about the team ups and the knowledge of people sort of just understanding that they are good here, but they can step back and create a space for somebody there. Because when it comes to learning design, you build out these experiences. You you are seeking to create this kind of perfect stage set that's unpopulated. And it still sometimes seems to me that then learning design and paperwork and language and learning outcomes and assessment matrices, all of that stuff is where people look first, and they look there first because it is harder to have this other conversation. And I'm not doing myself out of any work here. We do a lot of work around learning outcomes. We do a lot of work around sort of the ensuring that the paperwork and the alignments are as good as they can be. Which is why this is an interesting webinar for me, because it's like, and this is because you and I both come from a space of teaching and experience. It's a bit like, and then there's this other set of concerns. Then there's this other thing that's really important. And I don't think learning design should pretend that stuff doesn't make a difference, because it does.
Yeah, and I think this gets into some of the things we've talked about recently around this sort of hidden skill set of the learning designer and what learning design is, and because I think if you compare the learning designer to the director, then this idea that you might not be, as the learning designer, the person in front of those students, but you can do quite a bit to direct that experience through the materials that you produce, through the way that you sequence activities, through the content that you put into those activities, but also through the directions that you give. So it's often the case, we've worked with clients where there is a strong separation between the learning design team and the tutors, or the coaches or the facilitators, and the coaches and the facilitators are often just given a slide deck and they deliver it, and so the learning designer there has quite a bit of power to influence what happens in that room, even though they may never see those students. But it is about being very intentional around stage directions and giving very clear guidance for that facilitator, and questions, and say, right, this bit is 6 minutes, this bit's 2 minutes, this bit's 8 minutes, just like you would edit a section of a film to say, this bit's too long, this bit needs to be really short, in this bit, it's very much about questions. You can be really intentional and really play a very directorial role. And it's so grounded in empathy, because again, even if you never meet those students, the fact that you can put yourself in the mindset of those students, where they are in the experience, how much knowledge and skills they have or don't have, if you can empathize with them and think, what do they need right now, you can do quite a lot to mitigate the personality of the person who may be facilitating that. Even, again, you might not even know who's going to facilitate it, but you can be quite sure that as long as they follow these instructions broadly, that experience is going to work. So there's a really strong directorial role there in the instructions and the directions that learning designers produce, I think.
And I think I want to follow up, because I can just imagine that you were talking there about, like, you're talking there about how you can produce these stage directions. We've done it a lot around sort of onboarding, and where you say, look, this activity is 20 minutes or 10 minutes, because in that time the sort of the heart rate of the day needs to pick up again and need to slow things down. And again, I think all of that is a fascinating, and it's the idea, you have this idea of story beats, in sort of like narrative, where when a story beat lands, and if it's done well, it feels absolutely right. You've got directors like Kubrick, for example, who might extend a shot beyond comfort, but he's doing it to produce an intentional effect. It's not because he suddenly lost his mind. He's producing discomforts, and he's sort of using structure and stage directions and directorial flourish, always in the service of producing the conditions in someone else's mind. And so intentionality is the key thing. But it's so often people say, oh well, as learning designers, it's like, this came up recently, oh, does that mean that everything's got to be 10 minutes? The lecture is dead. Gamify everything. Quick, reach for a quiz.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's like, no, because if you go at this in terms of casting, this notion of, you and I have both been electrified for 40, 50 minutes by an extraordinary speaker. So the notion of duration, and I hear this all the time, people go, what I'm hearing from this is that duration is bad, or that the answer lives in duration. It doesn't. The answer lives in, if that duration feels absolutely right, then that 40 minutes, it was relative. If you're stuck in a lecture for 2 hours, and I was recently in an experience where I was literally stuck for like 3 hours in a space that was not being facilitated at all, I wasn't thinking this 3 hours has been thought about from my perspective. It's intentional. I was thinking, when is this going to end? When is this going to end? This film is too goddamn long.
Yeah.
You know, this is too long. And so I just want to be clear that those stage directions only make sense once they're contextualized by people performing their expertise and playing to their strengths. Because I certainly, you know, never want to advocate for a kind of a standardization model, because standardization, it stands against the idea of what it means when the casting is right. Because, you know, you could have an actor, a brilliantly cast actor. I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, someone talking, like a monologue. Someone talks at you for half an hour, and it's the most electrifying experience of your life. It changes your it changes your brain up. There's another half hour conducted by someone that is absolutely doing the opposite of that. And having the courage to not get drawn into these orthodoxies, but to sometimes think about the effect you're trying to produce and who's going to do that best. To me, that just seems to be such that's the agency. That's your agency rushing back in. That's not learning designers trying to kind of cut your food up. It's more learning design talking, if you can get into this subject area, it's about giving people their agency back. I don't know if you agree with that. It's about, you have more control and more power than you know, and that you have to be intentional.
I think that's exactly it. I think, and you mentioned standardization, which I think is really interesting, because often the format and the structure dictates the narrative and the journey when it shouldn't. Like, why does something need to be an hour or 6 months or 3 years?
Yeah.
When actually it could be longer, it could be shorter. And I think often people feel, and often people's hands are tied around that. They can't do that. It has to be 12 weeks. It has to be 6 months, and you just got to fill it. But I think even within that, even if you know that the duration is fixed, what happens within that duration, I think often you can do an awful lot more than people think you can. Often people come into that thinking, well, we've got to deliver 10 modules or 10 1-hour lectures. And you think, well, no, this is still going to be 6 months long, but we're going to do it differently. And I think this is where you can really look at the materials that you produce,
Yeah.
and the experiences. And so we called this last one the production design, because I think this is really where, if you think, okay, let's empathize with a poor manager who knows they've got 3 or 4 tutors who really don't like learners. Like, what are you going to do with that? It's going to be a car crash. So minimize delivery in terms of face-to-face delivery, but think about, well, how can we build some absolute quality resources? How can we maybe get some actors in to create some great short videos and use that, and then the tutors facilitate around those? How can we create more opportunities for self-directed learning where learners can actually learn in between the sessions? How can we use technology? How can we bring in AI and say, here's some questions, here's some prompts, go and teach yourself some things, and then come back in and ask some questions, and sort of redeploy the expertise of those people. They might not be great in front of a class, they may be better one-to-one. So how do we flip it so that the learners are kind of like front loaded doing a bunch of stuff, and then they come in and talk with the course team, and maybe it's more of a tutorial model. So there's a lot there that you can lean into in terms of your resources and the structuring of those interactions, which you may think at the start of that, well, I can't do any of that, I've got to deliver 6 1-hour sessions or whatever. So, well, do you have to do that? And if you do that, is it going to produce a worse experience than if you do something different? And I think that is really where you have to look at what power do you have, what levers can you pull to ensure that you're creating the best experience possible. And I do think often that, again, like casting, often people don't challenge the structure enough to go, if I do this, it isn't going to work. So why do it that way when there's other ways in which we can do this?
I'm sort of reminded as you were talking, Treves, to be honest with you, about the interesting thing about Netflix that I noticed was that, of course, back in the day, TV programs had to be half an hour or an hour, and then had to stop for the 9 o'clock news. And so there was a sort of interesting sort of durational infrastructure that used to sort of produce a kind of a rhythm for television and for film, or whatever, particularly for television because of the scheduling. And the idea that now, I think, on TV episodes in long running shows only need to be as long as they need to be, So if an episode of something works best at 40 minutes because the edit is resolved, then it's 40. If they need another 3 minutes, it runs to 43 minutes. And if it needs to be 70 minutes, like I think Stranger Things, the last season of Stranger Things, had entirely sporadic run times, and it was because in other words, the duration was beholden to the intentional effects of. And there's a question there about whether that Stranger Things is an interesting one because I'm not sure all the episodes did earn their durations.
Should they be 70 minutes?
But that idea of why an old idea produces a rhythm, and then you go, hold on, that's interesting. Like, why is it like that? Why, if the job is done in 20 minutes, and that if the story beats have been delivered and the mindset has happened in 20, but oh no, traditionally, this thing is an hour, or this course is like this long. I think that there often is those kind of historical, infrastructural, durational things at work that don't always stand up, frankly. I mean, we're not talking about casting now exactly, and we've extended the metaphor, I know, but I think this notion, I guess, really, the point about the casting director is that they are paid a huge amount of money to make choices between talented people. And so the nature of the choices comes from a place of deep understanding about two things. One is the story, the needs of the story. So how's this going to, and also the interrelationship between this cast member and this cast member. So these characters. So it's kind of like both the whole piece, and it's also how those pieces kind of like, start to talk to each other. And, I'm still, I went to see Nosferatu at the weekend, the new one, which was great and great fun. And all the time I was watching it, though, I was remembering Keanu Reeves in Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, which was the worst piece of casting. I mean, they cast a kind of like laid back, Keanu as Jonathan Parker, the kind of the uptight sort of like Englishman, and it was just the worst casting. And that was casting based around Keanu Reeves's box office gold.
Yeah.
So in a way it was like, but he couldn't even do an English accent. I mean, all I was thinking about was like, thank God Keanu Reeves, who I really like, by the way, is not in Nosferatu.
Yeah, they would have killed it.
And that so casting is also, I think it can be undone and sabotaged by institutional politics and egos and all of those things. We see that in casting. I was just reading in advance of this how John Wayne, famous sort of like, for his westerns, was cast as Genghis Khan, but spoke in his American accent, and it's like a famous piece of terrible casting.
Terrible casting.
And I guess that casting was around John Wayne is a box office draw. So he's what's most important. It's like, no, I think the story of Genghis Khan was most important, really, and you've just kind of completely torpedoed that by this piece of stunt casting. So I think, again, looking at why your big hitters are hitting big where, and why your institution or whatever it is kind of redeploying these people. It all says, is it working? Are the effects intentional? And how can you make these sort of story beats land, really, in terms of learning experiences?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and we're pretty much out of time. But I think just to sort of pull that all together. So, little quote. I mean, just to really try and articulate the kind of the importance of casting. We said the best learning experiences, like the best films, they're not just well written, they're well cast and they're well directed and they're thoughtfully produced. And learning designers have a role in that, as do the facilitators, the coaches, the people who are delivering it. So I think even with those constraints, even if you think, oh, my hands are tied, it's not like I can hire and fire people, but through good design, you can bring out the best in all of those people. You can control the show, you can direct the show, and you can deploy people at different moments to produce a production that actually it may not be the best production that you could ever do because you don't have complete free reign, but actually given those people, there will be a logical sequence to bring in those people to make sure that you maximize the value of their expertise and their ability to connect with other human beings, so that you produce the best possible experience. And I think that's through learning design. That's often what we're trying to do. Everyone's got constraints. Everyone's got budget constraints, content constraints, people constraints. So how do you orchestrate that in such a way that you produce the best possible experience given the constraints you're under?
And I know you're winding up, but I just want to say one final thing, which is that the reason why I think that casting is key is because it's a person piece, right? So at the moment we've got the rise of kind of AI avatars, because people have understood that if you're a learner and you're talking to a human being, somehow you're more engaged, and so that wisdom has been, is being recycled as the idea that people need people to learn. But I think people need authenticity to learn, and people need relationships to learn. And so when I think about now the value of the value of humans, real people in front of real people, I think you can off-world and outsource content now, because if you can get everything bite-sized on your phone, if you can just find everything, and now with AI as well, if you can sort of like short circuit sort of like the zeitgeist and find something out, there's a question, I think, and I find it a very comforting and intrinsic and important question, which is that if learning and if tech can produce the conditions for content more quickly and more effectively than ever before, then the role of relationships, the role of feeling connected to character has never been more important. And I think there's an advert on TV doing the rounds at the moment. I think it's advertising the Irish Tourist Board, and I think it's the actress and writer Sharon Hogan who says, you rarely remember what happened in the story, but you always remember the characters. And I just want to finish by saying that there's a big question mark about, an important question mark about, and I don't want to sort of get too grandiose, but about the human side of learning and why it's important, and why it's never been more important when it's never been easier to consume content. It's never been easier to find what you need to know. I mean, if I want to change a plug, I go on YouTube. If I want to, it's never been easier. And yet our need for human relationships, connections, to feel tutored, to feel listened to, quality of feedback, to feel like you've met somebody, that you've encountered someone's expertise, that you're in the proximity of a more knowledgeable other, those attributes, those characteristics of learning and how to design for it have never been more important, because it's the obvious thing that cannot be replaced.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Like if you ask yourself, what are you paying for?
What are you paying for?
Probably not content, because you can find that anywhere. So
exactly right. So you're paying for, I think it's about proximity to authenticity is what people would pay them, what embeds learning and what turns learning from being a mere acquisition to something transformational.
An experience. Yeah. I can feel that there's a follow-up podcast coming up from that. I think that's a good place to end. So thank you very much. Inspiring discussion as always. Really interesting to extend the film and the directing metaphor. I think, again, as we've said, there's a lot of parallels there. And if you like this, if you watch to the end, thanks for watching to the end as always.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. It's lovely that you're in the mix.
Do check out some of our other recent restreams where we've looked at, as I say, things like the role of editors, the parallel between editing and learning design. So check them out on ding.global. And keep an eye out for future restreams. We're here every few Fridays or so. Once topic takes us, and we should be here for more podcasts. So thanks. Enjoy your weekend.